Hi everybody, this is lecture 9, the trial of Paul, and it's chapters 22 to 24. So we come now to the climax of our story, the trial of Paul, which encompasses his apologia. Apologia, why I've lived as I've lived. His defense, really, of his unique vocation. It covers too his appearance before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. It covers the conspiracy to kill him, which results in his speedy transfer out of Jerusalem to the comparative safety of the Roman headquarters in Caesarea. The 4 different events in the drama engulfing Paul, this time in his life, neatly make the 4 divisions of our lecture. The first is Paul's Apologia before his people in Jerusalem. Chapter 22 verses 1 to 29. The second, Paul's appearance before the Sanhedrin. Chapter 22 verses 30 to chapter 23 verse 11. The third part of the lecture will be the Jewish conspiracy against Paul and his safe passage to Caesarea, chapter 23, verses 12 to 35, and the fourth and final part, Paul's trial before Governor Felix, and it's all of chapter 24, pretty well. Okay, the first section of our lecture. Paul's apologia for the way he's lived his Jewish vocation. Again, this is chapter 22, verses 1 to 29. Paul delivers this important speech just near the fortress Antonia in Jerusalem. And we'd say it's a classic apologia pro vita sua, apologia for the way he's lived his life. A speech which explains and defends his motives and his decisions, and it contains really a number of elements from a very classical way of defending yourself in the ancient world. Within it we'll find Paul's second account of his conversion on the road to Damascus, and we'll see that it's pretty well the same as we first came across that in chapter 9. Now he gives this speech in Aramaic, which seems to surprise his listeners. How could a diaspora Jew speak so fluently the language of Palestine? But he was educated, as he says, in Jerusalem, and he studied under the great Gamaliel. As he puts it, I was educated strictly in our ancestral law at the feet of Gamaliel. He then professes his love and his zeal for God, like all good Jews, and tells how this zeal pushes him with the blessing of, and he quotes, I quote, the chief priest and all the council of the elders. It pushes him to persecute followers of the way. He then recounts his Damascus experience, his conversion, which includes Ananias's words of commission. The God of our ancestors has chosen you. Just Johnson comments that these words have a sort of archaic biblical resonance, like the early speeches, God of our ancestors, the early speeches in the Acts of the Apostles. And they put the stress on Paul's call as coming from the God of the patriarchs, of our ancestors. He has, and I quote, chosen you to know his will and see the righteous one and hear a voice from his mouth. The title Righteous One was used earlier by Peter and then by Stephen. It's a familiar title to Jewish listeners. And of course, Seeing and hearing Jesus is to experience the risen Lord, one of the key prerequisites for being an apostle. You will be a witness, says Ananias, for him before all the people of all the things you have seen and heard. That's what an apostle is called to do. Next comes something a little unexpected. Paul says he's had a vision. He had a vision while he was praying in the temple. He had a vision from God while he was praying in the temple. This is quite brilliant, really, because in one stroke he does a number of things. He tells his audience what a pious Jew he is by going to the temple to pray. But then he also does something, and I quote Johnson, it's the most threatening for his hearers. He appears as a prophet like Isaiah, who also had a vision of the Lord in the temple and receives a commission to be sent. Back to Paul, Jesus tells him in this vision, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Echoing, of course, Isaiah's commission. Paul's zeal for God has been refocused from persecution of the followers of the way to a witnessing to Jesus before the Gentiles. The crowd vehemently turn against Paul, and the tribune orders him to be flogged in order to find out why the crowd has reacted so strongly against him. Paul is just about to be whipped when he says to the centurion standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a Roman citizen?" And this immediately puts a halt to the whole process, and he remains in protective custody for the night. The second section, Paul's appearance before the Sanhedrin. This is chapter 22, verse 30 to chapter 23, verse 11. Like his master Jesus, Paul is brought into the presence of the whole Sanhedrin. And that happens the next day, so that the Roman governor can get a hold of why the Jewish authorities are so anti-Paul. Paul's self-defense speech turns out to be really one of the most wonderful speeches, because he convinces the Pharisee party amongst the Sanhedrin that he is truly an Orthodox Jewish believer. And in so doing, Luke's subtly telling us that Christianity, this is part of his overall purpose, is the logical outcome of Judaism, especially of the Pharisaic variety. It's a real fulfillment of Judaism. Paul himself appears to open the proceedings by claiming that he's always acted towards God with a completely clear conscience. Incidentally, just in his letters, Paul often uses the word conscience. In fact, the word conscience in Greek is only found in the New Testament in St. Paul. But it's also here in the Acts of the Apostles and in one other place too. But it's mainly a Pauline doctrine or sense. The high priest Ananias was in office from 47 AD to 59 AD, a long period, and is known to have been a pretty cruel sort of an individual, quite avaricious, and he collaborated with the Romans. He has Paul slapped in the mouth, reminding us of how Jesus was slapped in the face in the presence of the high priest Caiaphas. Paul's reply, "You whitewashed wall," recalls Jesus' diatribe against the scribes and Pharisees. "You whitewashed tombs. And we sense the current high priest's hypocrisy. Paul apologizes, saying he really hadn't realized that this fellow was in fact the high priest. And then comes a rather brilliant move. Paul capitalizes on perhaps the key theological difference within the Sanhedrin between those two parties of Sadducees and Pharisees. And that was belief in the resurrection from the dead. I am a Pharisee, he says, a son of Pharisees. I am being judged because of my hope in the resurrection from the dead. The place erupts. And then a group of the Pharisees says, we find this man guilty of nothing wrong. Which perhaps again reminds us a little bit of the trial of Jesus and what Pilate said, that Jesus is innocent. And from the Pharisees' point of view, for St. Paul, he's innocent. Again, Luke's telling us through Paul that Christianity is basically a sect within Judaism. And in Luke's mind, of course, it's the logical fulfillment of Judaism. However, the situation gets worse in the Sanhedrin, and Paul is rescued once again and kept in protective custody in Fortress Antonia. Now that very night, the Lord appears to Paul, and the Lord encourages him, saying this, as you have given witness to me in Jerusalem, so now you must give witness also in Rome. Paul has very brilliantly and wonderfully witnessed to his faith as a good Jew, but his faith in the risen Lord in Judaism's heartland. Now the Lord wants him to do likewise in the capital of the then known world, Rome. Our third section we move into the Jewish conspiracy against Paul and his safe passage to Caesarea. We're in chapter 23 now, verses 12 to 35. 40 rather fanatical Jews make an oath together not to eat or drink anything until they've killed and done away with Paul. Johnson rather neatly says this: the resistance to Paul's mission among diaspora Jews is now hardened into a deadly resolve to ambush and to assassinate Paul. And as in the resistance to Jesus, the chief priests and members of the Sanhedrin are actively involved. Paul was in mortal danger in Jerusalem, just as Jesus was a generation previously. The official leadership of Judaism was still implacably hostile to Jesus and his message. We learn that Paul's nephew, who appears to live in Jerusalem, that he becomes aware of the conspiracy against Paul. Luke is the only New Testament writer that tells us that Paul has family in Jerusalem, which of course may be linked to the time of when he was studying under Gamaliel and where he stayed while he was there. Once the nephew tells Paul, Paul then informs the authorities, who rather beautifully believe him and take the necessary precautions to ensure that he's safe. He is to be transferred from the Jewish capital, so prone to disturbance, to the Roman capital at Caesarea on the coast, Caesarea Maritima, which was firmly under the control of the Roman administration. Beautifully rebuilt Caesarea by the great Herod the Great. They spend the night at Fortress Antipatris, a huge fortress some 40 kilometres short of Caesarea and built by the same Herod the Great. This was largely in Gentile territory, so safe from ambush. The tribune back in Jerusalem had written a letter to Governor Felix in Caesarea, informing him of the situation regarding Paul. We notice that when we read this letter, that it's a model of justice and fairness, and offers a very objective and rational account of this whole episode. The governor follows correct practice and inquires where Paul was born, for that determines which jurisdiction the place should be tried in, the case should be tried in. When he found out, says St. Luke, that he came from Cilicia, he said, "I shall hear your case when your accusers get here too." And he can do that because at that time Tarsus and Caesarea belonged to the same jurisdiction, the Roman administrative unit of Syria Cilicia. It was one at that time. We might remember that in Jesus' trial, Pilate decided to refer Jesus to Herod Antipas when he discovered that Jesus was from Galilee. And Galilee was under the jurisdiction of Herod the Fox. You remember Jesus calling him Herod Antipas. As we look at this whole episode, we can't help but contrast the attitude of the Jewish leadership with that of the Roman military authorities. The Jewish Sanhedrin was willing to give their blessing to the band of 40 assassins. The Roman authorities are impeccable in their concern to ensure Paul's physical safety and that a fair trial will take place. Johnson puts it this way: the behaviour of the empire is better in every respect than that of the Jewish leadership. However, as Johnson goes on to say, by extricating Paul from his Jewish enemies and placing him within the frame of the Roman system, that will in the end also reject him. But God is making it possible for Paul to bear witness before the people of Rome as well. God is clearly using the events of the world for God's own purposes. And here it's for Paul to take the message of Christ to Rome, which of course was capital of the then known world. So now we come to the fourth and the final part of this lecture: Paul's trial before Governor Felix in Caesarea. And that's chapter 24, verses 1 to 27. So now Paul's been moved to the great Roman capital of Caesarea. Michael Fallon says, the high priest and the Jewish elders are in foreign territory here, so they rely on a Greek-speaking attorney to put their case, a certain Tertullus, and his speech is rather brilliant, carefully flattering the governor and accusing Paul of 4 things. He's a pest. He's an agitator who's well known for stirring up trouble in Jewish quarters quite around the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and he's someone who's tried to desecrate the temple. Of course, we know, don't we, that these are just untrue. And these aren't the real reasons for why he's been arrested. We also know that. But Paul's self-defense is equally quite brilliant. He asks for evidence that he's been stirring up trouble in Jerusalem during his relatively short stay in the city, saying that, well, these people just can't prove what they're saying. He then explains that really the real cause for the dispute between the Jewish leaders and himself is in fact on a religious level. He is a faithful Jew, but he's not treated like that. And we quote St. Luke now. According to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors and believe everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. And Paul adds a hope, which he says is shared by members of the Sanhedrin, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. This hope, he says, motivates him to keep his conscience blameless before God in the way that he lives his life. And then he says that the real reasons of why he came to Jerusalem were to bring alms, A-L-M-S, not A-R-M-S, alms, money, to my nation and to offer sacrifice. And aren't they wonderful reasons for a good, pious Jew to come to Jerusalem? And then he concludes by saying, it is about the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial here before you today. We learn that Governor Felix was rather well informed about the way, perhaps from his current wife, Drusilla, the young and beautiful wife of Herod Agrippa I. However, we also learn that Felix isn't as honest as even the Roman commander in Jerusalem. So he keeps Paul in prison for the next 2 years, which is something quite sad, quite exceptional. Possibly he'd heard Paul say he'd brought money to Jerusalem. Our text simply says he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. Perhaps he wants to get Paul's money in some way. And we also learn a little further that, anxious to ingratiate himself to the Jews, Felix left Paul in prison. Perhaps he's anxious about his relationship with the Jewish leaders. A comment is made by Johnson, which I think is pretty pertinent. It goes like this: no matter that Paul's captivity is a lenient one, with the opportunity to see his associates, the reader begins to perceive that Paul's progress to Rome will be neither swift nor smooth. Paul must give witness to his Lord by suffering imprisonment. Nero appointed Porcius Festus as successor to the rather ruthless and vacillating Felix, who had been governor since 52, and in 60 AD is when the changeover happens. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that during his 2 years of administration, Festus was very conscientious and tried to bring peace to the Holy Land by trying to control and eliminate the Sicarii. They're those dagger-carrying zealots who assassinated Roman officials and any collaborator. And of course, from this time on, the early 60s is a time of growing unrest in the Holy Land, and the rebellion against Roman occupation is to break out in just 6 years' time. So we conclude. We've seen Paul clearly on the defensive here. We watch and listen as he speaks to the Jewish people just outside the fortress Antonia in Jerusalem. Then as he's brought before the Sanhedrin. And finally, after being rescued by the Roman authorities from Jerusalem and sent to the relative safety of Caesarea, we see him speak before the Roman governor, Felix. we are growing in our understanding that Paul's credentials are Jewish through and through, and that the gospel he preaches is best seen as the fulfillment of all that's best and progressive in Judaism itself, the Pharisaic form, which believes so strongly in resurrection from the dead. Christianity, in Paul's eyes, and as Luke sees it, remains the proud and grateful child of its Jewish parents. And Paul's whole life and his preaching is a wonderful testimony to that. Thank you.